Mainstream historians have a very serious problem when it comes to understanding North American history. Currently, they believe they have it all figured out. They have this nice, pretty, perfect timeline that goes back thousands of years that creates a perfect chronology that explains everything. And why wouldn't they? They have mountains of archaeological evidence. They have entire libraries full of countless publications that support the mainstream historical timeline. Everything looks very historical and scientific. Your average person looks at all of this information and they think, wow, yes, this all has to be figured out. Right? I mean, nobody in academia would ever publish a paper that is pseudoscience. Nobody in the scientific community would ever publish something that has no validity whatsoever, would they? And certainly, all of the other scientists and academicians would absolutely call these people out if they did. Here lies the problem. The history of North America as it is understood today is completely wrong. It is 100% wrong from a scientific perspective, and it is wrong from a historical perspective. The problem that the mainstream currently has is that the mainstream has ignored 90+% of the archaeological evidence that exists on this continent. And that's a scientific fact. The problem that the mainstream currently has is that there is an overwhelming amount of archaeological and historical evidence that supports a completely different chronology. It supports an entirely different story of what has transpired on this continent in the past few thousand years. Why are they ignoring this? The answer is simple. And it is also a window into how messed up our current society is. No, you do not live in a free world. No, you do not exist in a period of time where there is this mass enlightenment. No, you do not live in a period in time and history that respects the pure scientific method and tries to understand what actually happened in real history. You live in the exact opposite period of time. You live in a time to where there are people who have gained tremendous amounts of power over various aspects of society. And to maintain that power, they have gone to great lengths into controlling the historical narrative. Now, I realize that that sounds like some kind of a crazy schizo-conspiracy situation, but unfortunately, it's not. What I just said is a scientific fact, and the reality is it's incredibly easy to prove, and it's so easy to prove that I'm not even going to waste my time in this show to do it. But I wanted to throw that out there just so everybody remembers. Everybody needs to remember that history and science are beyond corrupt right now, at least in the mainstream, and in the alternative as well. Right, we're going to go over some of that as well. But ultimately, what we are running into, the problem that we are running into, is that we legitimately have a corrupt, authoritative institution painting a picture of North American history, and you are not allowed to go against that picture. You are not allowed to question that chronology that the mainstream has put in place. When it comes to North American history, we have some serious problems. Because the reality is, the entire historical record and the entire archaeological record that we currently know about and that is documented, it's a scientific fact, paints a completely different picture of history in North America. And this picture of history is not known to the vast majority of people nowadays. And the reason why most people will have no idea what we are about to discuss in this particular show is because the mainstream has made sure that only one very particular way of looking at North American history has ever been allowed to exist ever in the mainstream. You get what I'm saying? Okay, okay, I know. I'm just ranting. All right. So what am I complaining about here? All right, so here's the reality. One of the problems that we have in history is that we do not have a very good picture of what was going on in North America for the past few thousand years. right? At least in the mainstream. So when most people learn about North American history, they learn what the authorities want them to learn. And it is the most boring picture you could ever imagine, and it completely ignores all of North American Indian mythology and history, and it 100% ignores all of the amazing archaeological finds that have been discovered on this continent. And the reason why the mainstream ignores all of this stuff is because they have been told to ignore it. They have been conditioned and trained to believe in only one very specific kind of history. And that history is incredibly dull. That history is incredibly, there's just nothing to it. When your average person hears about North American history, all they hear is, well, there were some North American Indians here, and they lived here for thousands of years, and they just kind of roamed around and hunted buffalo, and that's all that ever happened ever, so do not ask questions, and completely ignore all of the evidence that we have found that completely points to a completely different picture of history. This is the thing, okay. That is what is going on, and the reason why is simple, because if you start to pay attention to what the North American Indians actually say, and you start to pay attention to the archaeological evidence that has been discovered in North America, suddenly an entirely different picture comes to life. And this picture goes against all of the current politics that exists today. It goes against all of the current claims to land that exists today. I mean, it just goes against everything. It basically goes against the current power structure. And it's literally that simple. I could have actually trimmed down this entire intro to the show to like 10 seconds and just said that. But I didn't because, okay, now we are where we are. Okay. So what I want to discuss today, what I want to go over today is just kind of the introduction into a huge field of history that we need more people looking into, because the ramifications of what we are talking about or going to talk about are huge. And what I want to talk about today is the fact that the Welsh, yes, the Welsh from Europe, made their way to North America and actually had a foothold on the continent for centuries. Now, of course, that sounds insane if you believe in modern mainstream chronology. The problem that we have, though, or that the mainstream has, is that there is so much evidence that the Welsh ended up in North America that it is embarrassing. It's insanely ridiculous. And to make it even funnier, the North American Indian tribes completely corroborate this tale. Now, this is why it's ignored. And this is one of the reasons why North American mythology is completely pushed to the side. Because it is, right? I mean, nobody takes the North American Indian mythologies seriously. Everybody just thinks, oh yeah, it's crazy god stuff, you know, snakes and bears and whatever, the deer god, and they're just crazy. They're just cave people. Just ignore everything that they say. And that's what's happened. Like, that is what has happened. So any recountings of these histories dealing with the Welsh that show up at a very specific point in time are also pushed to the side. And the vast majority of people have no idea that this even exists. And the reason why is actually very simple. Or the reason why this is happening is simple. Because if the Welsh had actually, if we acknowledge that the Welsh had made it over to North America long before Columbus, and this is long before Columbus, then that means that the people who could have claimed North America back during the colonization period would have been completely different. The entire political scene, you know, during the age of exploration would have been, you know, completely scrambled because of this, right? Because if the Welsh did indeed find America before anybody else did, then that means that particular section of Europe could make the claim. And in fact, it's funny, there is, actually, I think it's Britain, they do actually attempt to use this fact to help aid their claim to North America. This is not a well-known situation. But the reason why it's not played up as much as it could have been, or maybe should have been, is because back then the Welsh were still their own sort of separate kind of people. Now, most people nowadays have no idea that there are all these different kinds of cultures and people that existed in Europe. Because what has happened is that the mainstream has gone out of their way to destroy all of these cultures, right? The Welsh, they've literally destroyed the Welsh culture, right? No, there's no such thing as the Welsh really anymore, right? All of Britain has gone out of its way to just absolutely erase these people. So when they went to sort of try to use the Welsh landing in North America, a while ago, and we'll get to the dates in just a second, they tried to use it because it would sort of work for them. But the problem is that the Welsh themselves existed as their own people. So what that would have meant is that the Welsh as a separate entity would have then had claims over North America. So do you start to see how the power structures have to hide things and maneuver history to do basic things like land grabs or claiming land for a specific power structure? So this is why this aspect of history is not all that well known, is because the Welsh were still their own thing. And the crown did not want the Welsh to be able to lay claim to North America. Now, that's kind of outside of the scope of what this talk is supposed to be. But that's what we're dealing with. And those reverberations come down to us today. All of this stuff matters. It is in the best interest in the current power structures that rule over North America to ensure that nobody has any idea that there were other cultures in North America simultaneously with the various North American Indian tribes. Now, obviously, this is going to cause some people some problems, but don't look at me. Don't get mad at me for saying this stuff. Remember, this stuff is claimed by the North American Indians themselves. They have these stories. You don't need to get mad at me. Go get mad at them. Go fight the Sioux. Go fight the Paiute. You go fight them. You go tell them that they are wrong. Do not come to me. I don't want to hear it. Okay, I don't care. I don't care anyway, but I don't want to hear it. You go fight them. You go tell them that they're wrong. Okay, have fun. Right? But I'm going to listen to them. I am going to do what the rest of historians won't do. I am just going to take what they say at face value. And once we do that, the real picture of North America starts to come into focus. Now, there's another crazy aspect to this story. If you think it's as simple as the Welsh sailing over here and just starting to colonize like we generally think about colonization, you're wrong. Because the way that this starts is born out of the last major catastrophe that will hit this planet. So far as I can tell, and I am still working on this, and I just want to present the evidence to all of you, is that the Zero event actually explains how the Welsh will come across and discover for themselves that North America exists. The story begins with a Welsh prince named Madoc. Now, for those of you who are familiar with Prince Madoc, you will also know that he is potentially intertwined with the story of King Arthur. Now, this aspect of the story for me personally gets a little weird because the Prince Arthur story in general, in my opinion, the way we have it now anyway, is really a mixed up version of whatever the hell it originally was. So what I mean by that is that I think, in all honesty, the original King Arthur story had to deal with more of the Venus event situation, in my opinion. And I honestly believe that a lot of the original story simply had to deal with the cosmological bodies and their motions in the cosmos during that destructive period of time. But over or after the Venus event takes place, and of course that story starts to lose the real meaning of what it was trying to convey, the people who had the story started adding on to it, and it started to kind of get jumbled and mixed together, and just basically how stories, get mixed up as time passes. There's no weird, science behind this. It's just reality. So the legend of King Arthur as we have it right now might partially now be related to Prince Madoc and his heirs, but I don't believe that this explains King Arthur. And what I mean by that is that I don't think that North America is Camelot, for example. And a lot of Arthurian legenists, is that a word? Legenists? A lot of Arthurian historians don't really think like that, but I know there's a subsection that do. There are Arthurian legenists. I just made that word up. It's mine. You have to pay me like $10 million every time you use it now on your channel. But yeah, anyway, one of the interesting angles that the Prince Madoc story brings to the Arthurian legend is that because Prince Madoc will wind up in North America, a lot of those guys start to think now that North America was Camelot. And I don't agree with that whatsoever. In fact, I really don't agree that Prince Madoc is really all that related to the King Arthur story anyways, but okay. All right, I know I'm already jumping the gun, but I just wanted to throw that out there for any smartass who's like really into Prince Madoc. I just wanted to make sure that we are on the same page and that I don't really think that that's King Arthur. Okay, Now, for those of you who are not familiar with this story, there are two different versions of it. And the reason why this is important, well, there's a few reasons why it's important, obviously, but one of the main reasons why it's important for our purposes is that either version takes place in a different chronological period. And since in the show, what I would like to do is I would like to go over the evidence and potentially redate this entire situation, I want to make sure that we're covering both periods of time. All right, so there's two versions. The first version takes place around 1170 AD, and the other version takes place around 562 AD. Now that's one hell of a discrepancy, right? We're looking at about 600 years worth of difference. And the interesting thing about this difference is that this scholarship kind of semi falls into the realm of mainstream as well. And this really does elucidate how very little of a grasp that we have over real chronology. Because right here, when you go and you study Prince Madoc, and I highly recommend that you go after this and dig around, especially if you can find something new, that would be awesome. But when you go and you do this, you are going to be hit with these two separate dates. Now, the story itself kind of remains the same, which makes the dates even funnier. However, there are several major discrepancies which we have to pay attention to when we look at these stories to get a true insight into what actually happened during this period in history. All right, so the general story goes like this. And like I said, it's kind of the same for both, so in an interest of saving time, I'll just give you the general, and then we'll dive into the real one that I feel is the real one into more depth, and then we will paint a picture that might support the zero-event thesis further, while also having the zero-event thesis explain the situation with the Welsh in North America and potentially why they are... Well, okay, let's get into this. Okay, so here's the concept. Essentially, the Welsh will get on their sailing ships and they will sail across the Atlantic Ocean and they will end up over here in North America. Now, the first interesting aspect about this voyage that is made, and remember, this is the same for both of the time period stories, is that Prince Madoc will bring over all these ships, but they do not land on the east coast of the United States. At least most scholars agree that that is not where they land. They in fact end up in the Gulf of Mexico somehow. They actually don't land on the East Coast and set up shop there like you think they would, right? Like the original Europeans did when they came over. I mean, obviously, the first thing you're going to hit is the East Coast, and you would start there. It would be a perfect place to start, but for some weird reason, the Welsh don't do that. They sail over and they circumvent the entire coast. They end up going, obviously, around Florida, and they end up in the Gulf of Mexico. Now, once they're in the Gulf of Mexico, this is where their journey into America will begin. Because what they will do is they will use the Mississippi River to make it all the way up to the Ohio and the Great Lakes. Now, what's up there in the Ohio and the Great Lakes area? Right? You have the Michigan copper mines. You have all kinds of crazy stuff up there. All right, we'll get into that in a second as well. But for whatever reason, the Matic fleet ends up there, and they use the Mississippi, and they start to explore outwards from the Mississippi, not the East Coast. Now, here's the first problem for me right off the bat. Why do they end up in the Gulf? I mean, what is it called? The Gulf of America now? I'm going to call it the Gulf of Anachronistic Affliction. Yes, it is now my Gulf. Anyways, they wind up in the Gulf of Anachronistic Affliction, and they travel up the Mississippi and go out from there. Okay, so the general story is Matic comes over into the Gulf, goes up the Mississippi, discovers America for the Welsh, and they find that it is a land of plentiful. They also run into the North American Indians as well. Some are hostile, some end up being friendly, and we'll get into that in a little bit as well. But ultimately what happens is he will sail back over to Europe, and he will tell everybody, hey, look, I found this other continent over there. If we sail west, we can start colonizing. We have another place to go. Now, what happens initially is that everybody looks at Matic, and they're like, how the hell are you still alive, bro? Like, where the hell did you go? Because Prince Matic is apparently over in North America for several years. He doesn't just show up in America, hang out for a week, and sail back. He and his fleet, whatever he had, I don't know how many boats he initially had, they explore for a few years, and then they go back to Europe. So everybody's looking at him like, where the hell have you been, right? How are you alive? So they start questioning him, and then he tells them about North America, and nobody really believes him. So one of the other people who is in a position of authority says, all right, fine, give me your star charts, and then I will go and I will try to find this place to confirm it exists. The interesting thing that will happen with the star charts is that Matic's original star charts will not match, or I should say do not match, the star charts that the people over there in Europe are currently using. Eventually, this other guy will be like, fine, I'll go and I will try to see if I can't replicate your voyage. And so he takes a small fleet and he goes out, finds North America as well, sails back to Europe, and comes back and says, yep, Prince Matic is right. There is a huge continent over there that is essentially untouched. Once that happens, a huge fleet will set sail over to North America. They will follow the route, they will go into the Gulf of Anachronistic Affliction, and they will get to the Mississippi, and they will start to sail upwards, and then as they go up, they will start to expand outwards from the Mississippi. That's the general story, right? That's kind of the general overview of what happens. And remember, I gave you two separate dates. Both of those stories are fairly similar. Now, there is a lot of information, relatively speaking, on Prince Matic, but a lot of that stuff has to do with lineages, and there's a lot of regular European history as well. While it's all fascinating, that's not what I want to focus on in this show. What I want to focus on today is how Prince Matic was put in a situation to where he discovers North America for the Welsh. This is where things get extremely interesting if you pay attention to what is said in history. Because what happens is completely catastrophic, and it changes the entire historical narrative. But once we start to pay attention and listen to this story and take it like as a fact, we take what the recountings are as a real event, suddenly history starts to line up infinitely better. Not only that, but we're also going to start to see chronology make infinitely more sense. We are going to see all of the archaeology that is in the North American continent also line up with better dates. Alright, so when it comes to the Prince Matic story, what I just gave you guys was a very sanitized version. This is a version that a main streamer would give you if they are willing to acknowledge Prince Matic at all. Right? There's the whole problem of mainstream historians not wanting to believe certain chronicles and all this stuff, but we have to believe the ones they believe, of course, right? We can't ignore that. We have to believe what they believe, but we're not supposed to believe anything else that comes out of those periods, right? Okay. So Prince Madoc is interesting because the reason why Prince Madoc ends up over in North America is because a cataclysmic event will push his fleet in that direction. You know what? Before we go further, let me lay out the real chronology so we can get an idea of what actually happened, since we are going to go over what appears to have actually happened. So I gave you two different dates, right? 562 and 1170 AD. All right, those dates are based on mainstream chronology. The real date for this voyage is probably around 1,000 years ago. And around 1,000 years ago, according to science and history, it does appear like there was one last major cataclysmic event that would strike Earth. And this cataclysmic event would be heralded in by the planet Mars. All right, this is the Zero event. Now, how does Madoc have anything to do with this particular event? I'm not going to get into the details of the Zero event. Just know that during this period of time, around 1,000 years ago, and I say around because I don't have an exact date, and I'm not probably going to be able to give you an exact date for the Prince Madoc voyage. However, now that I think about it more, maybe we can get an exact date, sort of. All right, let's see if we can break that down. Anyway, the reason why the Zero event matters, the reason why it's very interesting that this event took place about 1,000 years ago relative to real chronology, is because we know there was a catastrophe that took place around this time. Every single culture on the planet talks about this, and we have all kinds of evidence everywhere that substantiates the claims. Prince Madoc and his fleet will end up being a victim of this catastrophe. The good news is for Prince Madoc is they will survive it. They will not be wiped off the face of the planet. And their voyage is actually extremely interesting when we get into it. It gets crazy. Must have been one hell of an adventure. Okay, anyway, so let's start with the chronology really quick, because this is a fascinating topic. The first date, 562. How reliable is that? Well, that's really based on mainstream chronology, right? That is, when you go and you look at all the documentation and you start to dig into that, you find that date really does pop out of a mainstream way of looking at things. So, in my opinion, that date is not valid. The events themselves are valid because the events for the 560 date are what talk about the catastrophic event. So does the 1170. They both do. I mean, they both technically do. But the 561 is based on a more mainstream understanding of chronology. Now, the 1170 date is probably the more accurate one, but not for reasons that you think. So right now, relative to our year, 2020, whatever the hell we're in right now, 2025 or 6 or whatever you're watching this, just say that, okay? But anyways, 2000 plus, right? So if we were to look at the date 1170, that's, 830 years ago? That's around 1,000 years ago. So you can make the mistake of thinking that is the correct date and that mainstream chronology is still correct, but that's wrong. That 1170 date is not 1170. It is I-170. That is the key. It is not 1,000 years ago relative to the Gregorian calendar. It is 1,000 years ago relative to what real chronology used to be like until the mainstream got a hold of the chronology and added literally thousands of years to it. So the 170 AD date might actually be more accurate. Now, I'll be honest, I don't think that's the end-all be-all for that date. It was probably, I'm just going to say it was around that time, but isn't it interesting that if we factor in real chronology and we factor in the I or the J170 and we get rid of the 1170, right? Suddenly, we're right next to the Zero event. Like, this is what real chronology does. Like, suddenly, all of these crazy things actually start to line up once you push away the mainstream garbage. All right, so anyway, so that date might actually be close to the accurate date. All right, so anyway, so around 1,000 years ago, we have Prince Madoc, and he's sailing out in the ocean. Now, there's two potential versions of what happens here, but both stem from a massive cataclysmic event. So when Mars is making a close approach to planet Earth, cultures all over the planet will describe Mars as being surrounded by steeds of fire, angry demons, armies of soldiers, all kinds of stuff like that. Now, I'm talking about the planet itself. When you read this from a mythological context, most people just believe, Mars, the god of war, is just some, mythological guy in the sky, and he has magical fiery horses up there, and all of our ancestors are stupid, right? That's what the general mainstream looks at these mythologies in the context of. However, that's not what they're recording. When all of these mythologies say that Mars was in the sky surrounded by, fiery demons and all of this stuff, they mean it. But what they mean is that the planet Mars itself, the actual physical planet, they could see it. It was like the same size, if not bigger, in our sky as the moon is today. They could see that, which means they could also see anything that would have been revolving around it, that would have been orbiting around the planet. And what they saw was all kinds of charged debris flying all around that planet. Right? These are those steeds of Mars. These are the demons. These are the soldiers that the god of war brings. They're not metaphorical. They are real. It's literally Mars passing by Earth, surrounded by all kinds of cosmological debris. And this debris is electrically charged, which means it is glowing. Right? It is moving. And since Mars is close enough to Earth, everybody can see this. Now, Mars will not impact Earth. Mars will definitely keep its distance. Okay, so don't think we're going in that direction. But the key here will be the fact that Mars is indeed surrounded by debris, which it obtained earlier during the Venus event. Remember, during that event, that's when Venus, absolutely zaps the crap out of planet Mars, right? Creates Valles Marineris, creates all of those amazing geological features that we see on Mars today. Once Venus absolutely decimates that planet, the fallout is that all of that debris flies out into orbit around Mars. And that is exactly what people are seeing around 1,000 years ago when Mars comes in for one of its close approaches. Now, Mars will have several close approaches to Earth, and these are measured in 12-year intervals. So you can go and look at other cultures that have a 12-year interval related to the god of war or to the planet Mars relative to whatever they wanted to call that god, and you will see that everybody has that. This is what they are talking about. Right, they were legitimately worried that Mars was going to destroy the planet during this period of time. Now, Mars will absolutely create devastation on this planet, make no mistake. But it is nothing like the Venus event. Mars does not come close enough. Mars does not have an electrical charge any longer that matters. Although I have a feeling that it still had a very slight one, and I think that the Earth will be zapped by Mars on the closest approach. And we'll talk about that in a different show because that gets interesting. Anyway, so when Mars is making one of its close approaches, it has a trail of debris with it. Like tons of huge just chunks of Mars and God knows what else, right? I mean, you would have chunks of every single size. You would have tons of dust particles. You would have pebbles, rocks, boulders, huge pieces of debris that are miles across. You would have all of that range because that's the debris that was blasted off of the surface during the Venus event. So Mars is shrouded in this stuff, and everybody records this. Now, the main cataclysm that Mars will usher in is the interaction between the planetary bodies themselves. Right? So when Mars gets close enough, it's going to interact with Earth. Gravitationally, but the major point will be electrically. However, Mars at this point in time is either almost completely electrically inert, or it's just, has a very mild charge. And in my opinion, I could probably see it still maintaining a very mild charge. And the reason why is because you can still see the glowing plasma around Mars and the charged bodies that are floating around it. So I would imagine that there's still some kind of a charge there. And the other reason why I believe there's a charge there is because right now, in my opinion, I believe that Mars and Earth will have a very small electrical exchange. And the only way you get that is if Mars still had some kind of a remnant charge. Now, Mars in the modern day doesn't have anything, right? It's essentially inert. It's got remnant magnetism, but now it's irrelevant. But during this period of time when it's flying by Earth, it still has a small bit of charge. Right, Venus did not take everything. It took most of it, but not everything. So when Mars comes close enough to Earth, several things are going to happen. The two bodies are going to electrically interact. What that means is you are going to have things like earthquakes, tsunamis, storms, crazy tornadoes, etc. on Earth being driven electrically by another charged body coming close. However, these events are not they're destructive, but they're nothing like the Venus event. We do not have continents sinking, right? We just have major crappy earthquakes. There are some really crappy storms that take place, all right? It's bad all around, and yes, we do lose some civilizations. And ultimately, Earth will be pulled slightly out of its orbit that it had about 1,000 years ago, and it will be permanently, its axis of rotation will be permanently changed latitudinally. So what I mean by that is, for example, Egypt about 1,000 years ago, Egypt, the Sahara Desert, that used to be a very good place to live. Trees, water, all that stuff, but now it's a wasteland desert. Why? Because during the zero event, Mars will connect with Earth electrically, and it will literally bow Earth. It will change the latitudes permanently. What that means is that where the Sahara Desert used to be latitudinally, it used to be higher, closer north, which means it could facilitate a better environment for life. Once Mars does its flyby, its closest flyby, it permanently tilts the Earth down further, which drags the Sahara Desert towards the equator, which permanently makes that area a place that will be doomed to be turned into a desert. And I've talked about all of this stuff, but that's the kind of stuff that happens here. But humans can live through all of this. This is not the end of the world. Yes, the Earth changes. The Earth changes completely. Everything changes. But humans live en masse. They don't die en masse. Don't get me wrong. People die, but it's not the end of the world. Now, remember what I said about Prince Matic. When Prince Matic comes back to Europe and he has his new star charts, they look at his star charts, the guys in Europe, and they're like, dude, your star charts are wrong. What is this garbage? The reason why the star charts no longer match is because of what I just told you happened. It's because the Earth was changed after this catastrophe. See, all of this stuff starts to make sense. All these weird little problems with the story, like the star chart part of the story, suddenly now there's an explanation for it. Oh, crap. Yes, Mars changed everything. Okay, so that's why the star charts don't match. All right, so anyway, let's get back to Matic. I know, I'm talking about the other crap. Okay, so the zero event catastrophe may be the catalyst that sends Arthur over to North America. Now, there are two versions of this. They both involve a catastrophe, but there's two potential ways this happened. So, and let me cover both of them because I don't know which is which yet. I don't have a solid grasp on this, so it could be either. Hell, it could be something else. I don't know. But right now, these are the two that we know. All right, so the first version is this. Prince Matic and his small fleet are out in the Atlantic Ocean. They're sailing for whatever reason. Enjoying life, drinking, puking, whatever. They're just out there smoking crack, trying to exist. They're not doing anything to anybody. And then all of a sudden, in the sky, a huge ball of fire lights up everything around them and screams by overhead. It rushes overhead with a huge gust of wind. Fire fills the sky. The ball of fire flies from northeast to southwest. After this huge ball of fire roars over them, in its wake, there will be a huge storm of wind and water. This wind and water will grab the fleet and it will drag them down into a southwest position across the Atlantic Ocean. This is how they make it to the Gulf of Anachronistic Affliction. Just imagine it. You have a Welsh fleet, a dozen ships or so, sailing out there in the Atlantic Ocean, around the British Isles or something like that. And this huge comet fireball just screams through the air. And in the wake of this screaming comet, you would have all of these, natural disasters just following it in its wake. And it sounds like it potentially grabbed this fleet and drug it across the entire Atlantic Ocean. Now, I know that sounds crazy, and I don't necessarily disagree with you, but this is one of the versions of the story. And interestingly enough, it works. It works. One of the main reasons why this works is because during the Zero event, everybody talks about a time to where massive amounts of stars fell from the sky. Right? The Earth is bombarded by all of this debris that Mars brings with it. Right? It's not just little meteors that hit Earth. There are tales of all kinds of insane stuff that rain down during this period of time. And there's cultures all over the planet record this like crazy. So it's not weird that a larger piece of this debris may have entered Earth's atmosphere, coursed across the sky, grabbed the Matic fleet, and drug it across the ocean. Isn't that interesting? Now, I'll do a show on this particular event in and of itself to prove to you that this actually happened. This was a real event. Now, did it grab the fleet and drag it across the Atlantic Ocean? I don't know for sure, because I still have a hard time believing that a fleet would survive a trip like that. How does that work, right? I guess you could get grabbed and it would accelerate you across a good chunk of the ocean. And if the conditions were good enough, I guess you could. I guess it could work. It's not impossible, right? I've never ridden in the coattail of a comet on the ocean. I've never done that, right? So I guess it's not impossible, but it's definitely an interesting perspective. But it does explain why they would go to the Gulf of Anachronistic Affliction instead of hitting the east coast of North America. Because if you have that comet starting from a northeastern position and flying southwest, it's going to drag you down southwest across the ocean, and you are going to completely miss the east coast of North America. You are going to end up potentially in the Gulf. And that's exactly what it sounds like happened. Now, the other version of this story goes like this. Same concept. The ball of fire will rip through the sky. But when this ball of fire rips through the sky, what happens is that the entire British Isle area is laid to waste. Now, this happens in both stories, by the way. But Prince Matic is not in the ocean yet on this second version. Once this fireball streaks across the sky, burns the entire islands, it just absolutely vaporizes everything on those lands, and it creates a situation to where there's plague and disease. All the stuff that we've talked about in the past that cometary bodies bring, right? It's everywhere. It's all the time. It's all throughout history. Same thing here. The British Isles become uninhabitable for around a decade after this event. So once this comet passes by and destroys all this stuff, and yes, it destroys other aspects of the planet. If you want to know what happens to the Mayan culture and why they'd suddenly declined, this is why. This is the comet that takes them out too. It's the same thing that takes out the British Isles. The Mayan thing is for a different time, but there you go. It gets crazy, right? It's all there. It all lines up. All the science is there. It's amazing. Okay, anyway. But when the British Isles are laid to waste, Prince Matic then decides, well, we got to find someplace else to live because we can't live here. And so they decide to set sail, and they go across the ocean, and for some weird reason still end up in the Gulf of Anachronistic Affliction. And then they'll find the Mississippi and they'll go from there. So those are the two major versions of the story, but both of them involve the catastrophe. And they should. That's exactly what we should expect. So either way, we find a catastrophe triggering the Prince Madoc expedition. And then once he goes over to North America and then comes back and reports what he has found, that is when the huge Welsh fleet will sail down to North America, and they will sail up the Mississippi, and they will begin to spread out from there. This is why we find countless Welsh artifacts in the area of the Mississippi. All over the Midwest, we have found all of this stuff. The mound builders could potentially be the Welsh. There's very strong evidence that that might be the case. But that's for a whole other show. Anyway, so when we look at the Prince Madoc situation, the Prince Madoc situation really does give us an insight into a very particular perspective on a time in history that the mainstream has completely ignored or made extraordinarily boring or completely just, made up things to fill in gaps. Like this is why we find the things that we find. So the Zero event really does end up explaining why the Prince Madoc story could happen at all. So when we read that mythology, now it doesn't sound crazy, right? When we hear Gregory Tours or whatever that guy is, he mentions, that the British Isles were on fire. Both islands just absolutely shore to shore, burning. This is why. This is why he wrote that. It's because it happened. This was part of the history, right? This is what... this event is crazy. I won't get it. I don't want to go off course any more than I already have. Anyway, all right, so with Prince Madoc's arrival over here in North America, you now suddenly start to find North American Indian traditions making sense. You will also start to find genetic evidence making sense. Right? This is the stuff that mainstream historians don't touch with a 10-foot pole. They don't want to touch all of the genetic evidence that proves that there were multiple races over here in North America during a time period when there's only supposedly supposed to be one. You know what's even funnier and even more disrespectful to the North American Indians is that the mainstream literally just lumps all North American Indian tribes into like one kind of a person, right? That's typical, stereotypical, guy with the feather headdress. They literally think that everybody was just that dude. Like that's it, like all these different cultures. When you look at all the different tribes, dude, you find all kinds of genetic variations. You find all kinds of people. It is insane. And one of the things that you also find is that you do indeed find European blood in the area as well. You also find other genetic evidence that the mainstream won't talk about ever at all whatsoever because it's just way too far-fetched, even beyond what we're just talking about here. But I won't get into that. I'm not going to get into that. So anyway, Prince Madoc, he shows up in North America. So for anybody who wants to know how you could get a fleet over to North America, that's how you do it, right? They were literally propelled over in one version of the story. They had help from the comet, right? From one of the chunks of debris that will be ejected from Mars and hit Earth. Or, right, these people just had the sailing technology to get over here. And in fact, in the story, they have to have the technology because they have a huge fleet that comes over anyway. Right? This is the stuff they can't teach in the mainstream because it throws everything off. Right? It gives credit to people that the mainstream doesn't want to have credit. It completely changes the geopolitical situation. It means that a lot of the North American Indian mythologies are now valid, which makes them have to start to look at other aspects that they don't want to look at, which means that those might be valid. So, for example, all the catastrophe mythology that North American Indians have, suddenly all of that might actually be real, right? And nobody in the mainstream wants to touch that. Because if you start to admit that these catastrophes are real, that means that our history only a few thousand years ago, only 1,000 years ago, is completely different. It means that modern geology is completely wrong. It means that modern history is completely wrong. It means that modern archaeology is completely wrong. It means that, the way the mainstream looks at human migrations is entirely wrong. It means that everything that we are being taught today is wrong. And you can't have that. Those people can't be wrong, right? The scholars can't be wrong. The academics can't be wrong, right? They just can't. They have to be right. They have a degree. It's impossible to be wrong. I paid, $100,000 for this piece of paper that says I'm smart. I'm smart. My friends cite my papers. If Matic is acknowledged, like he should be, if this whole situation is acknowledged, if the zero event is acknowledged, everything changes. And I don't just mean historically, I mean for you as well. That means your entire history is different. That means where you come from, what your ancestors went through, and what they put up with. What they fought through is completely different as well. And what that means is that the current power structure does not have any authority over you the way they pretend to have it over you right now, because nothing in the past happened like it actually happened. Oh, I know. All right. So, I know we're at 50 minutes or something. Okay, so with the Prince Matic thing, this is going to be like 20 shows. So there's a lot to go over, because it's not just Prince Matic showing up and then, having a few colonies and then, well, where'd they go, right? What happened to them? There's a whole story here. There's a whole history here, right? And that's the kind of stuff I want to go over. But I'll leave you guys with this. The Prince Matic tradition really does have the potential to explain a lot of the mysteries that currently exist in North America. And by that I mean, why do we find all these weird European artifacts? Why do we find Roman forts, or supposed Roman forts? Why do we find supposed Roman coins? Why do we find mounds filled with Europeans? Right? Or races that are like Europeans? Because the mound situation gets weird. Remember, the mounds never contain any actual North American Indians. The only time you see that is if there is an intrusive burial. You might find a North American Indian buried kind of in the top layers, but you never find them in the center. It never happens. What that means is that a completely different culture was here. Now, I'm not saying that the Welsh explains that, by the way, because the mound building thing, the whole thing gets weird, because it also begs the question, whoever built the mounds, were they also in Europe, but were they the Welsh? Were they somebody else? See, this is the craziness. This is the insanity, and it goes against everything that the mainstream teaches us. Especially human migrations. Like right now, human migrations, it's some of the funniest cope you could ever see. When you see the arrows kind of going everywhere and they're trying to explain why they find the DNA where they find it. And of course, they ignore a lot of the DNA where they find it because it doesn't make any sense. So for example, they completely ignore the Welsh part in North America. Because if they acknowledge it, what that means is that everything is different. Oh, okay, all right, now check this out. So another thing that's interesting about the Matic story, and this will set the stage for future videos, is that, Prince Matic and his voyage and all the stuff we just talked about, this stuff was generally known up until about the late 1800s. This was not a mystery back then. Nobody questioned if Matic had made it to North America. In America. Like, this was common history. This was just normal. If we were to travel back to like the 1700s and you were to ask about Matic, everybody would be like, yeah, no kidding. Duh. What are you, stupid? Yeah, we know that. That's just part of history. Right? This is a new phenomena. Scrubbing Matic from the history is a completely new phenomena. And it's following suit with the destruction of Welsh history in general. Right? There are forces on this planet right now that are destroying all of this. And if you think it doesn't affect you, I don't care if you're not Welsh. If you think it doesn't affect you, it does. Because they're scrubbing your history too. They're scrubbing mine. They're scrubbing everybody's. That's what they're doing. The real question you should be asking now is why? Now, I gave you a good reason, simply, for power and control. But is there more? Are they scrubbing it for other reasons? Right? Is there more depth here than we're ready to fully understand? Right? Because if all of this history is real, that means the things going on planet Earth are completely different. So it really does start to beg the question, what really is going on Earth? Like, all the way down to what the hell is a human? These questions really start to come into focus, and they start to take precedent. Okay. All right, I'm just blabbing. All right, so anyway, the prismatic thing and the erasure of prismatic, this is a new thing, right? I only learned about this like 8 years ago. I don't know how it is over there in the eastern half of the United States. I don't know if some of you guys know that stuff. I don't know. But over here in the west side, nobody knows about this. This doesn't exist. There's no such thing, right? Prismatic is not taught at all. There's no Welsh at all. There's nothing. It's all ignored, right? And any artifact that is obviously Welsh that has been found in the United States, of which there are tons, and Canada, just North America, they either say it's just natural geology that writes on those stone tablets in Welsh or in Colburn or whatever, right? It's absolute insanity. Like that's how ridiculous the mainstream is. And it's funny because the mainstream really is on a ridiculous level trying to push this stuff off. I mean, they literally do try to make excuses like that literal Colburn carvings that have been found in stone that have the Lord's Prayer is just markings from either natural geological processes or it's just a forgery. Even though the patina is like hundreds of years old, it's just it's so bad. All right, you get it. So we will do more shows in the future to where we go over Prismatic, what he accomplished, and what some of this may entail. So we have things like the mounds to worry about, forts to worry about, other structures in the Midwest to worry about, the Michigan copper situation, that might be related. Like all of this stuff, these might be the answers we're looking for. And ultimately, I may have one more catastrophe that we can talk about that, well, we'll get to that. Okay. We're like at an hour. We're done.